afternoon, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to host a presser on the subject of the evictions and forced displacements that are taking place in both Uzumba and Mutoko. This press conference is conducted in the context of the MDC Alliance's rural strategy, where we've set a goal to mobilize and penetrate rural areas as we approach the 2023 election. Now, Zimbabwe's rural population recently exceeded the 10 million person mark. The majority of our population live in the rural areas, yet the same populations face some of the worst underdevelopment, underinvestment, and human rights violations under Mr. Mnangagwa's illegitimate regime. Rural schools are inadequate and mostly ill-equipped. Young children are having to walk more than 5 to 10 kilometers a day to reach their nearest school. Their hospitals are equally inadequate. They are poorly resourced and inaccessible. Modern infrastructure is simply non-existent. There are no roads, there's no running water, there's no electricity, and no serious investment in the rural economy. There are no jobs, there is no public transport system, and food insecurity remains a constant threat. Now, it's against this background that the People's Party developed a rural mobilization and penetration strategy to ensure that no Zimbabwean is left behind in the fight to win Zimbabwe for change. Unlike the regime in Harare, we don't view people living in rural areas as pawns to be abused at election time. Rather, we view them as citizens who deserve dignity, who deserve a decent standard of living, and respect for their human and land rights. Their issues are our issues. Their struggles are our struggles. Their aspirations are ours as well. And so we've pledged to give expression to their quest for better lives, decent livelihoods, and access to basic services. We are raising the stakes on behalf of rural Zimbabwe. As stated in our People's Agenda, our goal is not to go to rural communities and offer paternalistic solutions. Rather, our structures are embedded within these communities and we're consulting them consistently. There shall be nothing for them without them. We will give their struggle a voice. We will fight for them on matters of the politicization of food aid. We will fight for them on matters of ensuring access to voter registration centers. We will ensure that they've got adequate polling agents to verify the elections that take place in their constituencies. We will give space to their community influencers to lead. We will make sure that the forgotten communities of Zimbabwe have a strong rural economy, have jobs and access to modern services. We will fight the Chinese corporations who seek to displace them from their homes and their heritage, desecrating their burial sites. For us, this is an election issue which we will campaign on and champion unconditionally and strongly. Big corporations must not trample over the basic rights of citizens. Any investment in their communities must benefit the locals as well. Due process and constitutionalism must be followed. Consent must be secured. Adequate compensation must be paid when displacement is absolutely necessary in the public interest and duly consented to. We've seen what's happened in Chiadzwa, in Inde, in Chilonga, in Chisumbanje, in Tokwe-Mkosi, in Chingwizi, in Mutoko, and in Uzumba, amongst others. Mr. Mnangagwa's illegitimate regime is constantly at war with the people, and we say enough is enough. This new colonialism offends what our liberators fought for during the liberation struggle. one of the key fights was the fight to the entitlement to land. Land is at the core of the people's dignity, and their right to it must be respected. And so without further ado, I'm going to defer proceedings to my colleague, Honorable Happymore Chidziva, who heads up the rural strategy in the People's Party, to give us a press brief on the latest planned displacements that are taking place in Uzumba and Mutoko. Now, the slight background to this is that President Nelson Chamisa, in conjunction with the parties, or the People's National Standing Committee, deployed a delegation to these communities who met the people on the ground to assess the socio-economic impact of the Chinese big mining activities that have commenced there. And this will form the subject of today's press up. Thank you.
Thank you, Spokes. In my capacity as Secretary for Rural Mobilization and Penetration Strategies, I led a delegation to Mutoko and Uzumba to express solidarity to communities that are being abused by the regime, to hear their concerns and map the way forward to ensure the protection of their rights and dignity. The visit, commissioned by the National Standing Committee, sought to establish the socio-economic impact of large-scale exploration and by Chinese companies on indigenous communities in Mutoko and Uzumba, resulting from the large-scale exploration by these big Chinese companies. This delegation term of reference were to identify and assess socio-economic activities which are significantly influenced by the ongoing mining activities, to examine local communities' perception on the Chinese mining activities, and to suggest interventions that can assist in empowering the communities to assert their rights and safeguard their communities. The delegations made the following findings. In Uzumba, the Chinese company Engine Mining started exploration in 2020 and pegged areas to be mined which cover a total of 300 hectares of communal lands and possibly displace nearly 12,000 people. The affected villages were informed of these developments a year after the arrival of the mining company. They were also informed that the majority of them would be displaced and should seek alternative settlement from their traditional leaders. Their consent was never sought, nor were they heard before the mining commenced. The large-scale mining activities are affecting 11 villages, namely Matena, Gotora, Mkanzi, Chimina, Manyani, Nenzou, Gonye, and Machas. Those affected are indigenous communities, households or families with an ancient and cultural attachment to the land. No alternative resettlement area has been identified, and there is no plausible compensation plan for those affected. In Mutoko, the Chinese company started exploration in 2020 and pegged areas to be mined, which covers a total of 117 hectares of communal lands. The affected community has not yet been formally informed of these developments, in total disregard of the community's right to information, their right to dignity, and their right to be heard. The mining activities will affect 4 villages in Ward 11 under Chief Msengezi. Impact on the community. The mining activities are at the exploration stage, which is comparatively low economic impact, but is critical since it is the first encounter between the community and the mining company. Both communities are indigenous communities and closely associated with their natural resources that have social, economic, and spiritual significance, and are therefore opposed to the mining activities in the area, but exhibited a sense of helplessness as they are confronting the potential for change induced by large, powerful external company, which is the support of the regime. The challenge is exacerbated by the fact that local government capacity or other forms of local representation are compromised and unable to safeguard their interest. The communities are self-organized to mount a resistance of the mining activities on their communal lands, which they understand will have the following negative impact. 1. Displacement and victimization, made easier by lack of protection of indigenous people's rights to their land. Loss of livelihood. The local economy is largely dependent on agriculture, and the communities will lose their farming land after the displacement. Community breakdown. The communities placed significant historical and sentimental value on their land and highlighted that displacements would destroy group solidarity, long-standing distinct systems of decision-making, and traditional leadership, strong family ties, and the cultural identity. The communities also place significant value on their spiritual shrines and the grave sites of their forefathers, which will be destroyed by the mining activities. Social services such as schools and clinics within these affected areas will be severely affected. Participatory development. The development is disregarded the universal principle of free, prior and informed consent, FPIC, in the planning and implementation of the mining project. The exclusion of the community will result in the violation of their land rights, access to social services, etc. The community is also not happy with the government's mechanism of responding and resolving their concerns and grievances, which they have viewed as coercive, intimidatory, and disregarding their right to withhold consent of use of their land. Our position. We unreservedly condemn the planned displacement of indigenous communities. The right to land, heritage, dignity of the people must be respected. This new colonialism offends that what our liberators fought for during the liberation struggle. One of the key fights was the fight for entitlement to land. Land is at the core of people's dignity and their right. It must be respected. You remember the Mnangagwa concept. We take exception to colonial legislation like the Mines and Minerals Act and Communal Lands Act, which partly enable their acts. These laws must be repealed, and instead we must have laws that speak to our issues and entrench our dignity and aspirations as a people. We condemn the degradation of the environment and the public health impact of the mining activities, especially the mining of black granite. To make matters worse, communities are not benefiting from all these commercial activities, but maybe Mnangagwa and his regime alone. These displacements concern us because they reflect a pattern of authoritarian conduct by Mr. Mnangagwa's illegitimate regime. Look at what happened in Chiadzo, Dinde, Chilonga, Chisumbanje, Tokwe Mkosi, Chingwizi, Mutoko, and the Uzumba disaster. These are not enough laws. There are not enough laws in place to protect the communities. Censor due process is followed and mandate consultation with communities to secure their consent. If there is to be benefit, it must accrue communities to communities. There must be shared ownership. Where displacement is absolutely necessary, due process has to be followed, and the consent of the communities is to be secured. There must be fair and adequate compensation to reflect their losses. Attention should be paid to protecting their heritage. The role of traditional leaders must also be respected as they are leaders within their communities. There must be consultation adequately and before any mining activities concern.
Okay, members of the press, I'm going to open the floor up to a few questions. If you've got any questions for Honorable Chidziva on either the rural strategy or the specific visits to Uzumba and Mutoko, we'll gladly take those now. As usual, may you respectfully just identify yourself and the news house that you come from, and then you can ask your question. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Yvonne Tagazin Daily. I wanted to know if the MDC actually has a plan in reaching Parliament. Are you going to push for the repealing of these laws? What action are you really taking as the MDC? Because these displacements have been taking place and continue to take place unabated, as you have said. But what's your strategy beyond the press statement?
Thank you so much. Yes, the MDC have a plan. The first plan that we have is to be with the communities, be able to safeguard their indigenous communities. The second plan is that we encourage the communities to vote for the MDC government, because we have a policy that will safeguard their communities.
And I think it's also worth adding to that we do have a parliamentary agenda for rural communities. You recall the work that was done by Honourable Molokele when the Inde issue happened. Similar steps are being taken, similar questions are being asked to the ministers responsible. In addition to that, in line with our broad alliance agenda, we're partnering with civic organizations that are interested in both the environment and the internal displacement of persons to ensure that the rights of these citizens are protected in the courts. And obviously we're assisting with the mobilization of these people to resist the displacements that are imminent. So we definitely are there. And obviously this press statement is just a reflection of the work that we've done over time. We've gone there, we've assessed the impact, we've sat down with both traditional leaders, with the communities affected, we've asked them what role they want us to play. And the critical thing, I'm sure Honourable Chidziva will say this, the first thing that they said is, please, we need a new government. This government doesn't care about us. We are hungry, we don't have hospitals, we don't have schools, and this government simply doesn't care. So we are absolutely taking all steps possible, using all tools available to us to ensure that the rights of these citizens are protected. Yes, Robert.
Yes, Robert Slamy. Have you ever tried to engage the local political leaders from Uzumba, considering that they are linked to one political party which might be in support of what is happening to the local community? And if you did, what has been their response? And if you have not, are you going to?
Thank you so much. When we say local political leaders, you know that we also exist in Uzumba. So we have political leaders from our movement in Uzumba, and we have political leaders from the other parties and PF also in Uzumba. Yes, at some personal level we communicate. The only problem in Uzumba is that the MP of that area is highly involved in the parceling out of the Uzumba indigenous community land. So it was so difficult to communicate with him, but I know that the councillor in that area is also coming from the area that is being affected. So he's working with the communities also, although the community leaders, the stakeholders there, they are so much interested in seeing the government and making sure that these lands are protected.
And just to add on to that, Robert, one of the big things that we established from the report that the delegation brought back is that the politicians that are ZANU-PF, including the MP, I know Honourable Chidziva didn't mention his name, but his name is publicly available, is siding with the DA and certain traditional leaders to actually facilitate the displacement of the people to make way for the Chinese miners. So what you have is a situation where ZANU-PF is siding with the big Chinese corporations, and the MDC Alliance is siding with the communities that are vulnerable, that are powerless, and that stand to lose their land, their heritage, their cultural sites, their burial sites, and their livelihoods. Entire ecosystems of survival are being disrupted wantonly, and as highlighted by Mr. Chidziva, no alternative place for them to live, to move to. No compensation has been put in place. In fact, there is no plan from the regime to protect the rights of these citizens as required by Section 71 of the Constitution. Section 71 of the Constitution is very clear about the steps that must be taken when there's a forced deprivation, and due process, consultation, compensation are key aspects of these, but these have all been violated, which is something I'm sure that will be taken up with the courts. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
Mashabwana from Zimbabwe. You highlighted earlier on that the local leadership in Uzumba in Mutoko is compromised. So is the MDC setting an alternative leadership, a grassroots leadership, that will actually partner with the community to make their grievances known as well as to champion their cause?
Thank you so much. Actually, in Uzumba, MDC has been existing in Uzumba since 1999. That is the reason why you have seen that there was too much violence in Uzumba. Houses were burned. The houses which were burned in Uzumba are for MDC supporters. That means that MDC exists in Uzumba. And as I said earlier on, that the ZANU-PF leadership, the local leadership of ZANU-PF there, they are partnering with the mining giants to pass out this land. The message from the community is just saying, Mnangagwa atengesi. And they have a feeling that they are being sold out because Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF have been winning Uzumba by stealing, not by actual votes. And now they are trying to displace these people, so that something can reflect in 2023 as if they support us in Uzumba. The MDC leadership there, they are taking an active role with the community stakeholders to make sure that there is leadership.
And just to buttress what Honorable Chidziva is saying, one thing that he hasn't said is that we have structures in all these rural areas, in all provinces in the country, and he's the one who personally has set those grassroots structures up, and he's only traveled to Harare for this press, so that he's actually embedded within these communities. And the MDC Alliance has been deliberate about the rural communities, and our goal is not just to use the people to win the election in 2023, but we actually want to see a modern rural economy. We want to see proper roads in rural areas. We want to see adequate schooling, adequate health services. We want to ensure that they've got modern farming facilities and capacity. We want to mechanize what's transpiring there. We want to ensure that all rural communities have adequate electricity. So for us, it's not just an election issue for the sake of it. We genuinely want to improve people's lives in those communities. Does anyone have one outstanding question? I know the journalists who come at the end and ask, but you're free to ask if your news house is in a different language, you're also free to ask your question at this point, if it's okay, if you have one. Okay, if there are no further questions, all that remains is for me to thank Honorable Chidziva for traveling all the way to Harare and making it for this press conference, and to thank him for all the work that he's doing with the rural mobilization strategy. It's really not easy to crisscross the entire country and make sure that all these various communities have a voice and their issues are adequately attended to. So I thank him very much for that. Thank you very much and have a good day.